The day my brother walked into my bakery, sat down at my best corner table, and told me I owed him half of everything I built, I almost laughed. Almost. I didn't, though. I just smiled, asked if he wanted coffee, and waited. Because I had been waiting for that moment for 7 years. Let me back up. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. 3 bedrooms, a decent yard, a mom who baked actual pies on Sundays, and a dad who coached Little League. We looked like the kind of family you'd see in a cereal commercial. What you wouldn't see in that commercial was the scorekeeping, the constant, exhausting, invisible scorekeeping. My brother. I'll call him by the name he preferred as an adult, which was a whole thing in itself, but we'll get there, was 3 years older than me. His name was Troy. Troy had always been the one my parents pointed to when they wanted to show the world they'd done something right. He was loud and charming and took up a lot of space in every room, and my parents loved that about him. They loved that people noticed him. I was quieter. I read a lot. I spent most of my weekends in our grandmother's kitchen, learning how to make croissants from scratch, how to laminate dough properly, how to be patient with something that required patience. My grandmother, Nana Bet, was the kind of woman who believed that food was a love language, and she taught me everything she knew. She also left me something when she passed my senior year of high school. Not a lot of money, just $18,000 in a savings account she built over decades, and a handwritten note that said, "Use this to build something that's yours." My parents knew about the money. I told them because I was 18 and I still trusted them. That was my first mistake. By the time I graduated high school, I had a plan. I wanted to go to culinary school, not a 4-year university, not the path Troy had taken with the business degree and the internship my dad had pulled strings for. I wanted the Institute of Culinary Education in New York City. I had applied, gotten in, and the tuition for the 2-year professional pastry program was just over $40,000. With Nana Bet's $18,000 and a part-time job, plus a small scholarship I'd earned, I could make it work. Barely, but I could make it work. Barely, but I could make it work. I told my parents. My mom hugged me. My dad said he was proud. Troy said something like, "Cute," which was Troy's way of saying he didn't take me seriously. 2 months before my program was supposed to start, I went to transfer Nana Bet's money from the joint savings account my parents had helped me open. Because I was 17 when it was set up, and that's how the bank required it, and found a balance of $214. I called my mom from the parking lot of that bank. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice. She didn't answer. I called 3 more times. I drove home, walked into the kitchen where she was making dinner, like it was a regular Tuesday, and asked her what happened to my money. She set down her spatula. She didn't look at me. She said, "We had some unexpected expenses. You'll be fine. You're smart." Unexpected expenses. $18,000. Gone. I found out later, not from her, from overhearing a phone call my dad had with his brother, that the money had been used to cover Troy's car loan, 2 months of mortgage they'd fallen behind on, and a security deposit on a new apartment for Troy when he moved to Atlanta for a job. My college fund. My grandmother's life savings. For Troy's car and Troy's apartment. I want to be honest with you about how I felt in that moment. Because I think people expect me to say I was devastated or heartbroken. And I was those things. But more than anything, I was done. Something just quietly closed inside me. I looked at my mother standing at that stove and I thought, I don't live here anymore. Even though I still physically did for another 3 weeks, I was already gone. I deferred my admission, picked up 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop opening at 5 a.m., one at a catering company on weekends, and I started saving. I told my parents I was staying local for a year to save money, which was partially true. The full truth was that I was saving money and planning my exit. I left 2 days after my 19th birthday. I packed what fit in my car, said goodbye to my dad, who looked genuinely confused, like he couldn't understand why I wasn't more cheerful about things, hugged my mom briefly, and drove away. Troy wasn't there. He hadn't been home in months. I didn't hear from any of them for a very long time. New York was hard in the way that New York is hard when you're 19 and you don't know anyone and you're working 45 hours a week and going to school. I shared a studio apartment in Astoria with two other people. One slept in the actual bedroom, one had the pull-out couch, and I had a sleeping area I'd curtained off in the corner with a tension rod and two IKEA curtain panels. It cost $750 a month. I ate a lot of rice and eggs. I learned to be very efficient with food the way you only learn when you can't afford waste. But I was also in school, and school was, I don't have a better word for it. It was mine. Every hour in that kitchen felt like something I'd chosen, which made it different from anything I'd experienced before. My instructor, Chef Pauline, once pulled me aside after a particularly brutal critique of my tart shell and said, "You have good instincts. Stop second-guessing them." I kept that for years. After I graduated, I spent 2 years working pastry at a restaurant in the West Village that had a Michelin star and a head chef who yelled a lot, but taught me more about precision than I'd learned in 2 years of school. Then I moved to a boutique hotel in Midtown as their in-house pastry chef, which paid better and was slightly less chaotic. I saved aggressively. I lived in a one-bedroom in Jackson Heights, and I drove a used Honda Civic, and I cooked most of my meals at home, which is maybe funny given my profession, but it's true. I had a therapist, Dr. Anand, who I started seeing about 2 years after I left Columbus. She helped me understand some things about my family that I'd been carrying around in a way I wasn't fully conscious of. The favoritism, the financial boundary violations, the way my parents had essentially treated my grandmother's gift to me as a shared family resource without my consent. She helped me put words to what had happened. She also helped me stop waiting for an apology that wasn't coming. My mom called twice during those years. Once on my 21st birthday, I let it go to voicemail. Once about 3 years after I left, when she said she wanted to reconnect, that things had been hard, that she hoped I was doing okay. I listened to that one sitting on my kitchen floor at midnight. I didn't call back. I wasn't ready, and honestly, there was no acknowledgement in her message of what they'd done. It was all soft language. Things had been hard. Things were hard for me too, Mom. You made them that way. Troy never called. That tracked. The bakery was not my original plan. My original plan was to keep working in restaurants until I had enough saved to open a small pastry cafe, maybe 12 seats. Tight menu, the kind of place that does one thing exceptionally well. But then my friend Yolanda, who I'd met in culinary school and who had spent 5 years in food PR, told me about a commercial space in Hoboken that had been a cafe and still had the hood system and the counter infrastructure in place. She thought we should go in as partners. I thought about it for exactly 2 weeks and said yes. We opened Linden & Co. in October of my 27th year, named after the linden tree, which produces flowers that smell like honey, and also because I liked the sound of it. We did pastries, coffee, a small rotating lunch menu, grain bowls, good sandwiches, soup in winter. We had 16 seats inside and a small patio with 8 more in good weather. We were profitable by month 8, which our accountant called unusually fast and which Yolanda and I called the sign that we had been right. By year 2, we had a small but loyal following, a line on weekend mornings that made me both proud and slightly stressed, and a waiting list for our holiday pie pre-orders. Local food writers had noticed us. A write-up in a New Jersey food blog led to a piece in a New York lifestyle magazine, and from there it grew slowly but steadily the way things grow when they're built on something real. By year 4, I was 31. We had opened a second location in Montclair. Yolanda handled operations and I handled the kitchen and creative direction, and together we had 11 employees across both locations. We also, quietly, had begun conversations with the landlord of our Hoboken building about purchasing the space outright. That deal closed on a Thursday morning in February. I signed the paperwork, went back to the bakery, made myself a cortado, and sat in the corner for a few minutes just breathing. I owned the building. I, specifically, owned it. Yolanda and I had structured things deliberately so that each of us held title to our respective primary locations. The Hoboken building was mine. I hadn't told my family any of this. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 7 years. The call from my mom came on a Saturday in April. I was in the Hoboken kitchen at 6 in the morning doing prep. I still do my own prep on Saturdays, partly because I like it and partly because it keeps me honest about what we're actually serving. When my phone lit up on the stainless steel counter with a number I still, after all these years, recognized. I stared at it for a moment. Flour on my hands, croissants in the oven. Then I answered. She cried. She does this thing, my mom, where she cries before she says much of anything, as though the emotion is supposed to communicate something that words can't. I waited. She said my name, my actual name, Sloane, the way she used to say it when I was little and she was happy with me. I noticed that I felt nothing much in particular, which felt like its own kind of progress. She said she was coming to visit a friend in New York next weekend and wondered if she could stop by, see me, maybe get coffee. She did not say, I'm sorry about the money. She did not say, I should have protected you better. She said she missed me and wanted to see my face. I said yes, because I had been working on myself for 7 years, because Dr. Anand would want me to make a considered decision rather than a reactive one. And because honestly, I was curious what she would say to my face that she hadn't been able to say over the phone in 7 years. What she said was that she had told Troy about me, about the bakery, about how well I was doing. She had seen the magazine article, someone had sent it to her, and she'd shown it to Troy, and Troy was so proud, she said. We're all so proud, Sloane. I asked her if Troy knew that the pastry program he'd inadvertently funded with my grandmother's money had turned into a pretty decent career. She got very quiet. I told her I loved her, because I do, in the complicated way you love someone who failed you. I told her I wasn't interested in pretending the past hadn't happened, and I told her I was open to a relationship if she was willing to actually talk about what had happened, not around it, not through it, but about it. She said she'd think about it. We said goodbye. She didn't come to visit that weekend. She did call 3 more times over the following month, though, and we had 2 conversations that were longer and more honest than anything we'd had in years. It wasn't resolved. These things don't resolve neatly, but there was something there that hadn't been there before. Troy, I later learned, had not been doing well. The Atlanta job hadn't lasted. There had been other jobs, other cities. He'd been back in Columbus for a year and a half, living, from what I could piece together, in a situation that was not exactly stable. He showed up on a Wednesday. Not a Saturday, not a busy brunch rush when at least the chaos would have diluted things. A Wednesday afternoon in May, when the bakery is calm and the afternoon light comes through the front windows at an angle that makes everything look gold, and I was sitting at the counter going through invoices with a cup of tea. I looked up and there was Troy. He was 40. He looked tired in the specific way that men who have coasted for a long time look tired when the coasting stops. Still handsome. Still that easy stance like he owned whatever room he was in. But there was something worn around the edges of it now. He was wearing a nice jacket, which I clocked as intentional. He had dressed up to come here. He smiled at me. The smile I remembered from every Thanksgiving table. Every moment when he needed something from me and was choosing charm as his instrument. Sloane, he said, this place is incredible. I thanked him and asked if he wanted something to eat. He sat down at the corner table, my best corner table, the one by the window, the one regulars fight over. And I brought him a coffee and a slice of the almond cream tart we had that week. And I sat across from him and we talked for a while about nothing. He asked about the menu, about whether we'd won any awards, about what it was like running 2 locations. I answered. I was pleasant. I was completely calm. Then he said, I wanted to talk to you about something. And there it was. He had an idea, he said. He wanted to be involved in the business, not as an employee. He was clear about that, like being an employee was beneath him, but as a partner. He thought he could bring a lot to the table. He'd been thinking about the food industry. He had connections. He knew people. What he needed was an equity stake to make it real, to show he was serious, to give him something to build on. He thought 25% was fair. To start. 25%, of something he had never touched, never funded, never lost sleep over. I asked him if he brought this idea to anyone else or if this was something he'd thought of specifically for me. He said specifically for me. Because your family, Sloan. Because I want to be part of what you've built. I said, very calmly. You want to be part of what you've built. I said, very calmly. You want to be part of what I built, with the money from Nana Bet's account. He looked at his coffee cup. That was a long time ago. It was, I said. It was also $18,000 that was supposed to put me through culinary school, and instead it put you in an apartment in Atlanta. He said that wasn't fair. He said our parents had made that decision, not him. He said he hadn't known about it at the time, which I didn't believe and still don't, and that I couldn't hold him accountable for something our parents did. I said I wasn't holding him accountable for what our parents did. I was simply contextualizing his request. He shifted in his seat. He pulled out his phone and then, I have to be honest. This is the moment where I had to work very hard to keep my face neutral, because what he pulled up on his phone was what he called an agreement he'd had drafted, which was a document that proposed him as a 25% equity partner in Linden & Co., Hoboken location, in exchange for, and I'm summarizing here, his expertise and network. His expertise, his network. He put the phone on the table between us and slid it toward me. He smiled. Just think about it, he said. I looked at the document, I looked at him. I picked up the phone, read the whole thing without saying anything, which took about 90 seconds, and set it back down. I said, Troy, do you know who owns this building? He glanced around. Your landlord, I assume. Me, I said. I own this building. I purchased it 14 months ago. Something moved across his face that I hadn't seen there before, a kind of recalibration. I also, I said, own the Montclair location, which I hold as the primary leaseholder, and I have a meeting next month with a broker about a third space in Jersey City, which, if it moves forward, I'll own outright within 2 years. I folded my hands on the table. So when you say you want 25% of what I've built, I want to make sure you're understanding what that actually means. He was quiet. I built this from nothing, I said. Not from family money, not from a safety net, not from connections. I built it after leaving home at 19 with a car and a deferred culinary school admission and a lot of anger I didn't know what to do with. I have 11 employees. I have a mortgage on this building that I pay every month. I have a business partner who works as hard as I do. And I have no obligation, not legal, not moral, not emotional, to give any of it to you. Troy said, Sloan, I'm your brother. And I said, you are, and I love you. But that's not a business credential. He sat there for a moment. I poured myself more tea. The afternoon light kept coming through the windows, gold and unhurried. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, I'm in a bad spot. I'm in a really bad spot, and I didn't know where else to go. I had prepared myself for anger, for escalation, for him to threaten to call our parents or make a scene in the cafe. I had not prepared myself for that. For his voice going quiet and honest in a way it almost never had when we were growing up. I said, I know. I told him I wasn't going to give him equity in my company. That was not going to happen, and he needed to understand that clearly without any ambiguity so he could stop holding on to it as a possibility. But I also told him that if he needed to talk, really talk, not strategize, I was here. That if he needed a referral to a financial counselor or a therapist or a job contact in an industry I actually knew people in, I could do that. That family meant something to me even when it had cost me, and it had cost me, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but it still meant something. He left without the document. He left the almond tart half-eaten on the plate, which I noticed because waste bothers me. He texted me that night. 2 sentences. I'm sorry for how things went. With everything. It wasn't a full accounting. It wasn't the apology for the $18,000, for the years of absence, for all the ways the family had aligned around him while I'd been on the outside of it. But it was something. And for Troy, it was more than I had ever expected. I thought a lot about what I would tell my 19-year-old self, standing in a bank parking lot with shaking hands and $214 in an account that was supposed to hold her future. I would tell her that the anger is good information, that it's telling her something true. I would tell her not to spend too much time waiting for them to understand what they did, because that waiting will hollow you out if you let it. I would tell her to find the people who will stand in her corner, the Chef Paulines, the Yolandas, the Dr. Annans, and hold on to them. And I would tell her to learn everything she can about laminating dough, about patience, about building something from the inside out, layer by layer, until it's something that holds. Because here's the thing, no one tells you about the version of the story where you come out ahead. It doesn't actually feel like winning. It feels like Wednesday afternoon light coming through a window, and tea going warm in a cup, and 11 people depending on you to get the ordering right, and a mortgage you pay on time every month. It feels like ordinary life, which is the thing you were fighting for all along. And sometimes, in the quiet of a Tuesday at 5 a.m., when it's just me and the dough and the hum of the ovens, I think about Nana Bet and her handwritten note. Build something that's yours. I did, Nana. I really did. There's a version of this story where I stay angry forever. I used to think that version was the honest one. For a long time, anger felt like the only accurate response to what happened. To standing in a bank parking lot at 18 with flour-dusted dreams and an account drained to $214. To driving away from Columbus at 19 with nothing that hadn't been earned by my own hands. Anger made sense. It was clean and it had edges, and I knew exactly where it came from. But here's what I've learned. Slowly and sometimes painfully, anger is good information, but it's a terrible place to live. What I did with mine, channeled it into early morning prep shifts in culinary school and 11 employees who depend on me to get the flour order right. That was a choice I made, one small decision at a time, over 7 years. Nobody handed me that choice. I made it. I think about Troy sitting at my corner table that Wednesday, dressed up in a jacket like the occasion required armor, and I don't feel what I expected to feel. I feel something closer to tired recognition. He had moved her life the way people do when they've always been the one the room adjusts for, expecting doors to open, resources to redistribute, other people's work to become available to them. That wasn't cruelty exactly. It was a failure of character that no one had ever asked him to correct, because no one had ever needed to. The family had always made room. What I had to learn, and it took Dr. Anand and a lot of honest Tuesday mornings to get there, was that his failure of character had nothing to do with my worth. That's not a small thing to understand. It sounds obvious written out like that, but living it is different. Living it means getting up at 5 a.m. and laminating dough and signing a mortgage and not waiting for someone to acknowledge what you lost before you let yourself build something new. Nana Bet used to say that patience isn't passive, it's the act of continuing anyway. She meant it about croissants, about the way you have to fold and rest and fold again and trust the process even when you can't see what's forming yet. But I think she meant it about everything. The patience she was talking about wasn't endurance, it was intelligence. It was knowing the difference between waiting for someone else to hand you your life and doing the slow, unglamorous, daily work of building it yourself. I don't know what happens next with Troy, or with my mom, who is somewhere in the middle of her own reckoning with what she allowed. These stories don't close the way you want them to. There's no document that gets signed, no moment where everything becomes officially resolved. There's just the next morning, and the one after that, and the choice, again, about what you're going to build with the time you have. What I know is this: the $18,000 my family took from me bought me something they didn't intend to give me. It bought me the absolute certainty that everything I have, I earned. Troy can't touch that. Nobody can. I did, Nana. I really did.